Hi everyone, welcome back to Show and Tell. I'm Billy and I'm your host. Today I'm going to be sharing with you a project that I have been working on for quite a while. In episode 8, I showed you part 1, and today I'm going to run you through the entire process. I'll kind of skip over the beginning since it's covered in part 1, and I'll take you through the end of my designing my very first sweater all by myself. I don't know that I would venture to do this again. It was a daunting task for me, and there were a lot of false starts and do-overs, but in due course, we'll get into all of that. So yes, it's Show and Tell. This is largely a podcast about vintage knitting. I often interview guests from other parts of the world, and some of those people are knitting from authentic vintage patterns. And sometimes I do as well. Right now, I'm in the midst of a knit along with some of my followers, and there's still time for you to join us. So I'm going to direct you to my Ravelry group called Show and Tell for details on that. And we Zoom so that we're all together comparing notes on what we've knit and the progress that we're making and problems that we've encountered. You can also find me on Instagram and on Ravelry as billietoy, and I'll put that on the screen for you to see. So without further ado, let me jump right into this. Oh, one more thing. If you like my podcast, please give them thumbs up. It will help me with my ranking within the YouTube algorithm. And if you haven't already done so, I encourage you to subscribe. It's in this corner, a little subscribe button. Also, I try and do subtitles for you. YouTube does them, but I go through them and tweak them because they make silly mistakes, like the word pearl, they spell P-E-A-R-L. Or like one time I mentioned Tutankhamun because there was all the rage in the 20s with the opening of King Tut's tomb. Tutankhamun, they spelled T-W-O-T-O-N-C-O-M-M-O-N. They didn't get the context of King Tut and a tomb. So yeah, so I generally go through those subtitles and try and correct things, especially when my guests are not native English speakers. So this is the sweater in question. It has a dolman sleeve, and you can see that there are 2 seams on the sleeve. There's a seam on the upper edge, and there's the more conventional seam on the lower edge. So there's a lot of seaming with this, especially because it's done on a small needle. And you can get all the details in my Ravelry project page. So yeah, it's fairly small needle. There were a lot of stitches, and you'll see later on, I grafted these live stitches to what I had finished on the top. So this is not a selvage edge. It's not a cast on or a bind off edge. So it was a little bit of a tricky thing, but these were live and I grafted it onto this part. I also changed the neckline a couple of times. I find V-necks really tricky, especially if you don't have good structure to support it. So I wanted to do something that would have a clear section in here. I don't know if you can see that. Maybe if I put my hand inside. Yeah, see it's sheer right in there in an area that may get a lot of stress. So I tried to do a little thicker edging so it'd have a little more support there. And at the end of the dolman, I did a cuff. So you can see these stripes alternate between wool, which is 100% merino, and a mohair silk wool blend. Both the yarns are by Santa's Garn. This is called tin mohair silk, tin silk mohair, and this is their Sunday. And the back is totally plain. The back of the sleeves are plain. The back of the body is all plain. Yeah. So in just a moment, I'm going to get some slides on the screen for you, and I'm going to walk you through kind of step by step how I proceeded from my original inspiration and up until the finished product. And I hope you find this a little different, a little interesting. So I'm going to say goodbye for now, and I'll be right back. So the woman who you're seeing is someone named Thelma Viscountess Furness. She was the twin sister of Gloria Vanderbilt's mother. And I assume it's a black evening gown that she's wearing, but the bodice of this gown is what I took as my inspiration. I very much liked that it was a combination of solid and sheer and alternating stripes. And also I noticed that the stripes weren't horizontal nor vertical, but actually they went from the lowest part of that V out towards her shoulder. So based on that dress, I made this little sketch on graph paper, and I tried to do it to scale. I have a fairly narrow neck, so I made the whole neckline what I thought would be 3.5 inches from center, so like 7 inches altogether. And then I tried to map out the width of those stripes, and you could see I moved the stripes kind of clockwise down from the right shoulder down towards the sleeve. And I wasn't sure about what was going to happen across the bust, but I figured as I started to knit and I saw the shape of my fabric, I would figure that out. I tried a few different ways. My original thought was to start at that dark V in the center and work my way out, because in that way I would be knitting perfect stripes. I wouldn't have to tinker with increasing and moving stitches over as I went up, but rather I could just do a horizontal stripe, and then when I got to the shoulder I would start to try and pivot that stripe. And this was my first attempt at that. And it looked like it was going okay, but it didn't take me too long to figure out that my angle, the shape of this wedge, wasn't the right contour exactly. So then I also went and tried this, and this flared out too much. So what I'm saying, and you can go back to the part 1 episode and see, I just was struggling with getting it right. But one thing I knew for sure, I didn't want to have to do stripes that weren't regular stripes. So I went back to the drawing board and I did another sketch. And this sketch I tried to do life size so that I would be able to place my knitting on it as I progressed through to make sure that I was on track. So here's an example of that. I had started in the center at the V-neck. I did a little I-cord to give it a nice structure, and I worked my way across heading towards the shoulder. So I had these two pieces, a left shoulder and a right shoulder. And then I decided before I went on too much further, I really should see what was going to be doing with the back, because I thought if I could get the shape of the back to be good and right and fitting, that everything else would sort of fall into place. I really was reluctant to start at the ribbing and knit upwards towards the neck, because I didn't know how the shoulders were going to shape out with the front part, and for sure I had to match up the front to the back. So rather what I did was a provisional cast on. The red yarn that you see at the bottom of the burgundy, that's my chain stitch that I provisionally cast on to. And then I was knitting up towards the neck. So I had this fairly narrow piece with the shoulders. And everything seemed to be looking okay, except when I took the provisional cast on out to try and knit downward, I noticed that I had this ridge, and that didn't appeal to me. So I thought, well, this provisional cast on, and I tried steaming it out, I tried blocking it, and I was still getting that ridge. So I thought, okay, that is not going to work. And I went back and tried to figure out some other strategy. Now I started with casting on just the back of the neck, and I thought, well, I already have the shoulders from the front. Maybe if I start at the neck and work down from the neck, that might work. But I quickly found that having these two front pieces and the back was rather unwieldy. So I set up kind of an armature for myself. I made this piece of Tyvek in the shape of what I thought my shoulders should look like, and I pinned these pieces onto that just so that everything wasn't flapping in the wind. And at a certain point I was able to kind of try it on my shoulders, see how it was going to be. At this point, I shifted away from attempting to work on the upper part, and I went to the lower front part, and I started to knit up because I was concerned about how was I going to attach this bottom section to the shoulders. And I thought, if that binding together doesn't look neat, I'm going to have to rethink the whole thing. And that's exactly what happened. I think you can even see in these pictures that the stitches that are on the upper needle are not as evenly spaced as the stitches that are on the lower needle. So at this point I already knew I was in trouble. But in order to not lose all of that knitting, what I did was I thought, well, let me use that bottom part to create the back. And my next concept was make the entire back. It's all one piece. Make that whole thing, get that to be the right shape, and then go back and get the fronts to match up to the back. Of course, I had no idea about how deep the arm size should be. Typically for me it would be 8 1/4, 8 1/2, but I knew with this dolman thing I was going to need to add in more room. And I also have found that a lot of times on me, because I'm kind of narrow on top, if there's too much fabric in a sleeve, it's very unbecoming. So I was juggling with how do I get my sleeve to not be bulbous and overwhelming, but I also wanted to have enough space in there that I can move around freely and not have anything pulling. So I started going to some YouTube videos of people who sew, and I found my way to this woman who coincidentally has the same surname that my husband and I have, although we can't figure out if she's related. We don't believe that she is. Anyway, Susan Elias was the person who gave me some guidelines for how deep the dolman sleeve should be and how to taper it. And I really followed her advice well. She doesn't have experience with knitting. She's strictly sewing, but I thought it should be more or less the same, and certainly if it would work with a fabric that doesn't have give, my knitted fabric would probably work very well. So here you can see a series of steps where I kept measuring the width, measuring the width. I wanted to make sure every step of the way down towards the cuff that I had enough space for my arm. I do not have a slender arm, so I was pretty concerned about that. I forgot to mention that because the back is all knit in one continuous piece, I was going back and forth on some very long rows, but they got longer as I went up the sleeve. In other words, from the underarm, I don't know how many stitches at this point, but let's say I had 150 stitches from underarm to underarm, I don't know. Then I would graduate out a little bit more, kind of doing short rows back and forth, extending, extending, extending. And then once I hit the length of where I wanted the cuff to be, then I knit straight up. But then I had to start decreasing as I approached the neckline. So all the while I'm moving up, but I'm keeping in constant mind the depth of that sleeve. The next thing I decided to do, once I had the shape of the back in place, I decided to use waste yarn, scrap yarn, and just kind of do basting stitches on the angle of where I wanted the stripes to be. And at this point I had abandoned my two fronts and I was starting from scratch with the front striping section, the upper fronts. Now I had another bright idea, which was to redo the fronts, starting with a provisional cast on that was going to go from the bottom of the V out towards the shoulder, because I knew now what that measurement would be, because I could see it up against the back. And then I started to knit up towards the neck and down towards the sleeve. So two separate stages of knitting this front part. So it was front shoulder continuing on down into the sleeve. This time, not only was I trying it on periodically, but I really paid a lot more attention to the lower edge of the shoulder section, because I knew I was going to have to graft it to a bottom front. And I made the bottom front the same as I made the back. Now I was able to knit up from the ribbing, and I grafted the live stitches from the bottom onto the lower edge of that shoulder piece, and voila! It all came together in the end. This was quite a daunting task for me, but I stayed the course. I put it aside for a while and got busy with other things, but in the end, I have a sweater that I'm very pleased with. So I hope you found this interesting. Again, a little reminder, public service announcement. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up and subscribe so that you'll find me. I am starting to do things on a fairly regular basis. Thursdays at 2 o'clock seems to be my good time slot. So 2 o'clock Eastern, try and check in on me, because sometimes I'm going live and you'll be able to chat with me. I look forward to hearing your comments about this. I'd love to know if you have tried to design anything of your own. And with that, I'm going to say toodaloo. I'll see you next week. Bye now.